Shalom Chaverim. We are on the road to Zion, and today we are meeting somebody. His name is Ryan Turkienicz, and he is from Toronto, Canada, and he runs the Daily Brine. If you don't know what the Daily Brine is, it is basically what The Onion or Clickhole or Babylon Bee. It is a satirical content engine that just brings the purity of what The Onion was like 20 years ago when it was actually funny, in my personal opinion. And it seems like he has been growing very, very rapidly, and it's obvious because of how, frankly, witty he is. And so I'm very excited to have the editor-in-chief on here to talk about his journey and what the Daily Brine is, how it came up to be, and where we're going to go from there. All right, so Ryan, why don't you tell us who you are? What is your story?
Okay, I'm Ryan. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I have a business background, real estate investment. But for the past year and a half, I've been doing Zionist satire on Instagram and on social media, and have grown a bit of a following as the Daily Brine. So your initial intro was spot on. We're like the Onion or the Babylon Bee, but Jewish, but pro-Israel, trying to use satirical news headlines to fight the misinformation about Israel and Judaism.
That's awesome. So why? Actually, before I go into that, can you tell us a little bit more about you personally? What is your kind of background in terms of your Jewish identity? Are you a practicing Jew, or were you less observant, now more observant? Are you more Zionist, obviously not less Zionist, but just what is kind of like your relationship with being a member of the tribe?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like a lot of Jews, October 7th was a wake-up call to be more active, to try to take something of a leadership role. And some people kind of use the term October 8th Jews and say it's just a flash in the pan. But I don't think so. I think it was a real wake-up call that it's in our generation's hands now to, I guess, step into those shoes and lead what Jewish life is. So my family is strongly culturally Jewish. Both my parents were born in Israel. On my father's side, the family goes back over 200 years in Israel. And then on my father's father was a Polish Holocaust survivor. My mother is an Israeli from Tunisian background. So in many respects, I have a background from all over the Jewish world, and I feel that allows me and my brother through the Daily Brine to express a lot of different points of view through our satire.
And so, thank you for that. And by the way, it sounds 200 years sounds very colonizing.
Exactly.
Why did you choose humor? Because just like you, I would say that despite being involved in the Jewish world prior to October 7th, in a variety of ways, I kind of fell into this content game because I just needed somewhere to scream into the void where it would get some kind of reaction, whether it was positive or negative. And I got both, and it just led to this big following. But, the Daily Brine is definitely something that is like intentional. And so, and it's obviously very different than far more than what most people do. I would say it's probably the most unique angle of content that we have when it comes to this issue. And so, how did you come up with this? Do you have a background in comedy? What was the origination point of all of this?
Yeah, it came from wanting to use our superpowers, quote unquote, to help in any way after October 7th. Some people's way of fighting was through fundraising and donations. Some is actually fighting and being a soldier in the IDF. With myself and my brother in particular, we have a long history of comedy and comedy writing, both in a semi-professional way and just casually. My brother is a graduate of the Second City's conservatory program. And for decades, even, he's done sketch comedy, satire writing, comedy direction. He's been nominated for a Canadian Comedy Award. So that's where I guess the professional element comes into it. And myself, I've also done a fair amount of improv and some satire writing. But for me, it comes more from social media, from always trying to have the funny comment on social media posts, from sending memes in the group chats, things like that. And just from the natural comedy that comes from being part of a Jewish family. Like most Jews I know, just by being part of the community, are semi-professional comedians.
I mean, that's very fair. And so when like was this like a very intentional thing with you and your brother that said like we need to fight and like we're going to create this, or did you just start sending out memes and then as you got the kind of like what happened with me or many others where it's like you just needed some sort of sense of catharsis and the positive reaction said, okay, well clearly people are resonating with this, so let's turn this into something more professional.
Yeah, I think it was more on the intentional side where we realized there was a need for it, both because of the slew of misinformation and also because we thought more humor needed to be brought to the conversation from the pro-Israel side. And my brother's done some satire news writing for other publications in the past, so we knew that this was a skill set we had already, and we thought this was how we could deploy it, essentially starting a satire news publication to put the lie to the anti-Zionists and to express the pro-Israel point of view using some levity, some humor, some satire.
What's the creation process like? Where do you focus your intention or your attention on every day? Do you focus mostly on leftists, on Hamas, on Israel, like kind of like on a daily basis? What does that process look like of coming up with the theme or coming up with the meme of the day and sending it out?
Yeah, I would say it mostly is leftist because they have been the loudest. But of course, right wing anti-Semitism is equally dangerous. But it follows more from the news cycle. So
Mm.
whatever's in the news that day or in the few days previous, almost unintentionally, almost naturally, will be what we start pitching ideas on. And so it's a very informal process. Really, it's a WhatsApp chat where we'll pitch ideas. Usually they come fully formed from one or the other of us, or we'll workshop them briefly until it's ready to go.
Nice. And one of the things I've been hearing a little bit more about when it comes to comedy, especially as we kind of like see this rise in, I think right now, like right wing comedy or right wing comedians, but you have people like Shane Gillis, you have people like Andrew Schultz, you have certain people that are either kind of like getting away from what I thought or what I think maybe the comedy was for the last decade, which is like left wingers making fun of Republicans and right wingers. And now you see a little bit more of people who are willing to kind of make fun of the culturally left. And I think that there seems to be this kind of like misnomer about like, what does it mean to check power with comedy? And many people on the left might say that like they're still not the powerful, and so they're maybe confused as to why they would be made fun of or why you would see people like Shane Gillis and Andrew Schultz and others becoming more and more popular. Have you been seeing the same thing? Do you think, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not as much into it? Where do you
Mhm.
kind of like land in that?
So I'm not too familiar with those comics in particular and what their politics might be, but I don't look at it as necessarily a right or left thing. Like we're intentionally not coming into this to try to own the libs or to try to stick it to the alt right. Right? We're trying to express a point of view. It ends up being more of a centrist type take, and we're following those same rules of what you're saying. I guess the more classically left-wing comedy does, of not punching down, not trying to make fun of anyone's suffering, trying to go after people in positions of power who are misinformed or willfully misusing it. And so those on the left, if they're protest leaders, for example, they might think they are the oppressed, but they have the loudest voices in the room. and they're intentionally taking that position. And that in itself is occupying a place of power, in particular if you're spreading misinformation, willfully or otherwise. So we don't look at it as punching down in that case if we're trying to satirize those types of people.
No, I think that's really wonderful. And maybe like in that same light, you have some people from the right who, I think are starting to express some callousness towards the suffering of Palestinians. And so, for you, where do you guys draw the line personally and professionally when it comes to that in terms of what is the difference between making fun of, Hamas or making fun of the leftists and, making fun of the people that might be actually impacted. So for instance, you have leftists, but then you also have, for instance, like an individual who is detained by ICE. And, in my personal opinion, like there's probably a reason why that they're being detained by ICE as opposed to everybody else. But nonetheless, like that person is still experiencing this really negative experience. And so for you, how do you draw that line between where you decide, okay, this feels like we're making fun of the right people and this is somebody that we're going to kind of stay away from?
Yeah, we've been very intentional with that from day one, and making sure we're focusing only on quote unquote legitimate targets. And so making sure we're not making fun of anyone's suffering, especially not of civilians. We're not making fun of Palestinians like a lot of people have started doing. It's more about satirizing someone's point of view, someone's actions, someone's hypocrisy, rather than someone's identity. And that's where I think a lot of it differs.
Oh, I think that's a really good distinction, that you're satirizing and making fun of someone's point of view, their opinion that is hypocritical or that is convoluted or, anything of the sort, rather than like making fun of them just because of who they are. Does that include, or, so far I know that there's a lot, obviously there's plenty of material for the left. Where do you guys fall on the right, both like the American right and also on the Israeli right?
So we got into this with two goals. Well, it started with one goal, to counter misinformation. And then it evolved into a separate goal of trying to build confidence within the community, because we saw that was a huge impact we were having, and all the positive feedback, a lot of people telling us we were the first thing that made them laugh after October 7th, or the only thing making them laugh in this whole situation. And so it kind of evolved in us trying to occupy kind of a unifying space, right? Like the enemy's out there, and there's other people who've taken it upon themselves to look inward. There's many topics that can be criticized within Israeli society, within Jewish society. That's just not the role we've chosen to occupy during this crisis situation and during the war. So we don't get too involved in the divisive internal politics in Israel. In the States, we do it when it's just so juicy on both sides, right? Because both sides have been doing such objectively ridiculous things from time to time that like there's just great comedic concepts that come out of that. But it's not our main mandate.
Yeah.
You got the Babylon Bee, you got the Onion. We aren't that. And so it only comes in tangentially when it applies to the Israel conversation.
Do you think that will change? Because I agree with you. There's a lot that, people want me to, use my platform and my way of fighting to attack things like, whether it's like the settlers or it's Netanyahu or Ben Gvir or anything of the sort. And, my take has always been, whenever to them is always like, look, like there's plenty of people that are criticizing us from everywhere else. Like I don't need to add to it. Like that doesn't mean that I don't, have my own thoughts and opinions on those. It's just like during this time, like when you're in survival mode or when you are in a war, like you focus first on the external pieces. And then when you feel like you're at peacetime, then you can start, looking more inward. Do you feel like that would be a direction when we're maybe, more comfortable? However, long it takes, is that something that you have thought about, or are you still kind of strictly, you're like, look, there's plenty of material out there. Like, there's this anti-Semitism is only going to get worse. So like, that's what we're going to focus on.
I would say anything is possible. Anything is possible. But we're still kind of in that wartime mode where we're not really looking at that quite yet. And it's also what do people like us for? What do people know us for? What do they trust us for? And it has evolved into being that unifying centrist voice. And so it might be that some of the more internal criticism can be done within the community in order to preserve whatever unity there is and bring people back from the extremes rather than constantly, picking apart everyone's positions within the community as well. But it remains to be seen.
Totally. Kind of speaking about that then, in terms of what does this evolve into, or what does this go into? I know that you have more than just the Daily Brine. You also have, and maybe less well known, maybe more well known just to me, but you also have the Ironic Dome. And you have a few things that are underneath that. You have the Spark community mobilization app. You have a couple other things. You, I think, have a group chat that people maybe can apply to. So what is the Ironic Dome? And was that created before, after? Like, where did those pieces come into play?
It was created after, and it's also kind of an exercise in trying to organize and trying to be unified, because the Daily Brine, its power comes from being the objective voice, from being news satire. But we also saw the need for community building. We also saw the need for collaboration with all the meme creators, all the sketch comedians, all the people on X, all the people on Instagram. And I personally didn't see Daily Brine being the brand or the venue to do that, because we would lose that objectivity of being the news, right? And so that's where Ironic Dome comes in. It's like, how can we leverage the people? How can we leverage all these people that make hilarious comments, that are curating all these great memes and posts and satire news from all the different accounts, and get them organized, have them get to know one another on a more personal level. And instead of it just being sharing stuff on social media, it's actually using comedy as activism. So that's Ironic Dome. And Spark, that you mentioned, is simply a tool to mobilize that, right? So essentially, we've got a WhatsApp chat where people are just constantly kibitzing and sharing material and crowdsourcing memes. But then Spark is how we mobilize that and try to put a message out. And so, similar to the Daily Brine, it operates on a specific set of values, not punching down, not spreading misinformation, and so on and so forth. And we feel in that way, if we can build a community around that and inculcate those positive values of how you can use comedy to change the conversation in a positive way, then all of us will rise together. So that's Ironic Dome. So the plug is, go to ironicdome.com and you can see how to get involved in any way you want.
And so for you, when you say that, comedy as activism and using Spark to mobilize people, what does that look like in real life? How does that translate? And what do you either expect, if it's maybe kind of still in the works now, then what does that look like going into the future?
Yeah, so we're trying to keep it as simple as possible, because people's attention is divided in so many different directions. There's so many people competing for it. So on a very simple level, it's about crowdsourced content. So putting together, whether it's in a WhatsApp chat or any other way to mobilize it, putting together funny people to crowdsource memes, tweets, satire news, anything funny about the news of the day or about the headlines or just about anti-Semitism in general. And then posting that stuff on social media along with other posts that we find that are funny, right? And you upload all of that to Spark, and then it's a circle. It circles back to the community. It tells them these are the posts of the day. They fit with our values. They're actually funny. get them out there. And
So you allow for, you're just like, yo, like we appreciate your effort, but like we're not going to use it.
it's both. It's
Yeah.
both. It's creating new content. It's putting funny comments on content that's already out there,
Oh,
and it's amplifying content that's actually good, whether it's created by us or by others.
what do you think is like the for those out there that maybe would now be interested in joining that WhatsApp group? I don't know how exclusive it is or anything like that. For you, like, what is like the premier joke look like in a meme or anything of the sort? Because I always love hearing what every comedy comedian has to say about what the perfect joke looks like.
The perfect joke.
But for you, like, exactly, it's always an eye in the beholder. But for you, like when it comes to this specific kind of like
Yeah.
medium of content, what is that head like that you're like, wow, like you
So
just nailed it.
I again, I'll go on the theme of the simpler, the better. And I'll go with one of the headlines that my brother came up with that's been relevant over and over and over again. Hamas says no to ceasefire, demands ceasefire. It says so much in one line, and everyone hears it and just gets it.
Yeah. You're right. Like I can't even explain, like, I mean, like you could, but obviously you're not supposed to explain a joke, but that's so true. And so, you were also just recently invited to join the first global cohort of Voice of the People, that is essentially, I guess, like sponsored or is organized by the Israeli president, President Herzog. You are actually the first guest that I've had on here who is a part of that. And so I'd love to give you the honors of explaining what it actually is, how you got approached, how you got to join this, and what does that look like to be a part of it.
Well, first off, it's a huge honor and responsibility. I'm absolutely honored to have been chosen and accepted for the program. And it's a group of 150 Jewish people from around the world, from all walks of life, a very diverse group. We were actually chosen by an algorithm. And so that's why you don't see a lot of the brand name activists and influencers and advocates. You do see some of them, but you also see a lot of rank and file Jewish people who are just very committed, like to roll up their sleeves and get stuff done. So this group of 150, it's 50 from Israel, 50 from North America, and 50 from the rest of the world. And we're put into groups to solve big problems facing the Jewish people, things like the rise of anti-Semitism, relations between Jews and non-Jews, relations between Israelis and global Jewry, relations between Jewish groups within Israel. Huge problems, and extremely ambitious to say, not that we're even going to solve them, but that we're going to even move the needle on them. But the important thing is that we're trying, and that we have what I think is an amazing group that's going to do that. Diverse voices, new voices, and committed people who like to get stuff done.
That's awesome. And so when you said like the different groups and they're handling the, I guess, like different issues, like how is that organized? Like do kind of like different, sub cohorts or different groups like choose what they want to go after? Is it kind of chosen for you based upon the type of content that you create? Where are you? What group are you?
Yeah,
what issue are you tackling?
So I think the group, like the cohort of 150 was chosen by an algorithm. But the subgroups, so they've broken us into subgroups, and each subgroup is assigned one of those problems. And I think those are built to have diversity within the subgroups and also to cater to people's strengths. So if you have more perspective on intergroup relations within Israel, maybe you would have been put into that group. Or if you have more relationships within diaspora communities, you might have been put into that group. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's how it worked, because we were put into groups and assigned the problems to work on.
And so what problem are you assigned to work on?
So my team is working on Israel and global Jewry relations, which if I had to choose one, that is the one I would have chosen. Because, like I mentioned before, I have a background both in Israel and in North America, and from many different walks of Jewish life: Sephardi, Ashkenazi, North Africa, Poland, Canada, and even the old Yishuv in Israel for over 200 years. So I believe my lived experience can speak to that problem in particular.
And I'm obviously not asking you to solve that problem on this podcast,
Mhm.
but if you could just maybe give your quick diagnosis from your own personal perspective of the diagnosis of what that really means, and kind of like maybe the first big idea that you had when it comes to that
Yeah.
specific issue, what does that look like?
So, and this is my opinion personally, because in the council and in the conference, all these conversations and even just defining the problem is still ongoing.
Mm.
But my personal take on it, just from having been a part of the community the past year and a half, is that it goes to that old saying from Peter Drucker that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? If we can build a strong person to person culture, I don't know how yet, but by getting to know one another better, person to person, that's half the battle won right there, because we won't be fighting for an idea. We won't be fighting for, a philosophy or a concept. We'll be fighting for one another. And people who are doing that are unstoppable.
And so, how are you maybe internalizing that, maybe just in your own personal life, or as well as with your content?
Well, one of it just happened today. Right before I joined you, I had lunch with several Jewish advocates from Toronto that we've put together a group chat over the past year and a half to share memes, support one another, have fun. And every few months we meet for lunch. It can be as simple as that. But then on a more scaled level, it's things like Ironic Dome, where again, part of the goal is to use comedy as activism, but part of it is just to get to know one another and make connections.
That's awesome. And so then, what does the future hold for the Daily Brine, for Ironic Dome, for yourself? What is the
Yeah.
evolution?
Listen, I'm looking at this all as a long game, because it's become very apparent that over the past 20, 30 years, our adversaries have been preparing and laying groundwork to stand against us, and I feel like we also need to uh, rebuild some of the connections that we've lost, and start thinking generationally rather
Mm.
than just in the few years in front of our face. So we're going to keep making satire news. We're going to keep making fun memes. We're going to keep building community, and honestly see where it goes. Just try to keep snowballing it and building it exponentially.
I love that. And I love what you said about the generational part, because that's also something that I've been thinking about a lot. I think that perhaps we as a Jewish community have kind of shrunken our, we talk about, Passover's coming up, right? And we say, oh, well, remember, 3,000 years ago, you should think of yourself as though that you escaped Egypt. But I think that, like, in terms of the actuality of our history, I feel like we have lost that essence. And we kind of feel as though that our people are somewhat new, because Israel is only 75, 76 years old. And so the Israelis, right, the Israeli culture is less than a century old, just by the timeline, right? Or when a lot of people think about current American Jewry, they kind of go just to 1945 and the Holocaust, because so much of our culture is shaped around the Holocaust. And
Uh-huh.
so we don't necessarily think about our history, or really the future, at a generational level, versus, I think, like you said, many of our enemies think of themselves in a generational level, right? That they think that
Yeah.
this is just the next war or the next battle in a 1400-year war. And so we almost have to think like they do in that way.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the issue is up until the last couple of generations, it was just a given there was no such thing as Jewish life and non-Jewish life. It was just life. Like the world didn't allow us to have anything other than Jewish life. So of course we had institutions. They were our entire lives. And then it's only in the last few generations that, we've had the scope to explore so many other avenues that we need to put conscious effort into this question of how do we become a people again? How do we reestablish connections? How do we, build unity? It used to be the world doing that for us, and now we have to put some intention to answering that question.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I have one last question, which is, and I ask everybody this, which is, other than falafel and shawarma, what is your favorite Israeli food?
I guess I'll give the first one that jumped to mind, and it's another stereotypical one, but schnitzel.
There you go. That's great. That's totally fine. I just
schnitzelim.
As long as everyone, if I didn't make that caveat, everyone would choose one of those two, and so I have to put it out there. I think schnitzel is great. How do you eat your schnitzel? What does your schnitzel look like?
I like a schnitzel sandwich. Yeah, I love a schnitzel in a sandwich. Maybe a little eggplant, maybe a little hummus and trina, some schug if you want it spicy. And so then you're mixing like the European flavor, the Mediterranean flavor, the Middle Eastern, and it's uniquely Jewish.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for being here. Everybody, please go and follow the Daily Brine and make sure that you also check out Ironic Dome. And once again, thank you so much for bringing much needed levity to our lives post October 7th.
Thank you so much.
Shalom Aleichem, everybody.